Awesome. So how would you work with, let's say a DeFi, someone who wants to build a DeFi protocol on Cardano and stay on the Cardano blockchain? What are the steps for a project to work with the Cardano Foundation on that?
So actually, that's a very good question, and the steps might be a little bit complicated because, as I was trying to allude to, we are really focusing on the infrastructure piece.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about it, there is a value capture layer, and that's typically where the DeFi protocol sits. And that's also where the gaming protocol sits, and that's where somebody who wants to use the database called a blockchain would be operating. So they're trying to capture some value on top of the operating model. Then what we have below is what we call the value creation layer. And the value creation layer has two large components to it. One is the actual blockchain, which is very much the domain of IoT, until we can get into a situation where we can get more third-party contribution to the actual blockchain, and we get more action around the SIPS process, and we can get an exit strategy from the SIPS process, so the community knows that when they're proposing something and it goes through certain steps, that there either is a funding mechanism or way to implement it. And in there is also where we have a lot of these utility tools, such as a DB Sync, or we need to have exchanges around that, or we need to have the ability to have an end of day file or an end of period file to ensure that it can go well into your bookkeeping system, so you can pay the taxes in the country you're in. Outside that, you might be in a country who accept the DAO or something like that, but many others would be, need to pay some taxes. And that's exactly where we belong. And where we're trying to make the most of our effort is in this value creation layer. So when a DeFi protocol comes and says they would like to work with Cardano Foundation, it's typically because they're lacking something. So they have a really good idea to do something up in the value capture layer, but they see there's a gap between what they're trying to create and what the blockchain and the existing infrastructure stack is actually offering. And that's where we then go in with them and we listen to the feature request and we see if we can either build it together, if we can get somebody to build it, if we can do an RFP, if we can give a grant, or in other ways, how can we get to a situation that not only that DeFi protocol can get this missing infrastructure piece, that belongs to the whole ecosystem. So instead of the Cardano Foundation focusing on one use case, one company, we tend to think about how do we ensure that when we build something together with the DeFi protocol, that this can be used across the board. So a good example on that is, for instance, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but Matthias Benkow from our team, he did a community ecosystem developer survey. And there it was asked, what is the 10 most used libraries or tools which people are using? And one of those is actually the DApp, which basically came out of a SIPS proposal where we got Imurgo to the table, we spent some money on the table, and we got 5 binaries to implement that. And that means that a lot of DeFi protocols and NFT protocols on top of that can then use that tool. So we think about it like this.
Do you know what CIP that was by any chance?
Oh, I can't remember that, but we can
no
put
worries.
it in your show notes.
For whatever reason, the numbers really stick with me. So yeah, continue. Sorry for that.
Yeah, no problem. So, but that's kind of the idea. The idea is that if we build a tool, that it becomes available for everyone, and wherever you are in the world, you can build your value capture on top of that. So we're really trying to be in that kind of the bridge between the value capture and the value creation layer.
So that's why you guys have been hiring developers recently, correct?
Yes. So as you know, I've been on board for 2 years now. And when I took over the Cardano Foundation, there was very, very few technical people. I think if we somehow are going to be the custodian of the brand and the code, and we're going to participate in the governance going forward, it's extremely important that we actually are able to read the code, that we can understand how the incentives play out, but also that we have the ability to understand when people are asking for help with a piece of infrastructure connecting to the blockchain to do a reporting to a bank or to do something, that we actually can look at the architecture and can start actually writing specs and scope on it. But besides that, there's a couple of things which unfortunately you probably won't get rich by doing, but needs to get done.
Yeah.
And I think, now luckily there's I think there's 5 or 6 different versions of DB Sync out there. So different people have said, DB Sync definitely does not work as good as it does. But what we think is that there definitely needs to be some kind of a reference code around some of this utility. So the idea is to upgrade the developers, or upgrade the knowledge, the IT knowledge and the programming knowledge of the Cardano Foundation, ensure that we get the best of the open source ecosystem. That's why we hired Dear Quandle. So when we build something that actually is being built in such a way that third parties can contribute to it, and by that it gets this snowball effect running, that if people need something, they can contribute to it. There's an established process, like the SIPS process, but there's a structure to it, but also that the libraries has a certain structure. And that means that, that they're built in such a way that you understand what the code is doing, and you can actually read, the notes in there, and there's ways to interact with it. And that can be very hard if you build something, and it's a small team, maybe 5 to 6 people who's been working on it, and they never really meant to get outside contribution, compared to building something where you from the start are thinking about how do you get outside contribution. So there's many reasons why we're going down the developer path, but the real thing is, how do we ensure that we can build some of these developer tools? How can we build utility things which can ensure that there is reference applications out there which the community can take and they can use in wherever country and whatever vertical they see a value capture is needed in.
Yeah, I mean, building a strong open source ecosystem on Cardano is huge, because it was one team that built DB-Sync and it was IOG. And as we move forward to, a better, more decentralized protocol, you need, large entities building out open source tooling for developers, whether it be dApp projects or even just DAOs on Cardano. So yeah, from my perspective, that's great to hear. And that really leads me right into my next question about, the role of the Cardano Foundation when, the 3 entities, started in 2017, IOG, Emergo, and the Cardano Foundation. Everything's changed since then. It's been 5 years. We just celebrated our 5-year anniversary here recently. So what is the Cardano Foundation's role in Cardano now? We've talked about it a little bit, but how has that shifted, in the past 5 years?
Yeah, so I was not there 5 years ago, so it's a little bit hard for me to do like a hard reference point.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right. It's shifted a lot. So has the protocol. The protocol now has, hundreds of applications on it, and there's, thousands of people who write code every single day and so on, right? But how I look at it is that there's a couple of things who needs to happen. So first of all, the community is extremely important, because with a public permissionless blockchain where the code is public source, maybe not open source. So today our code is actually not what we call open source, but public source. That means it's available, but there's not a good way to contribute to it. And the code is, even though it's very strong, it's not written in such a way that contribution and the social systems and initiatives around it is there. So in the first aspect, what I'm thinking about is, how do we ensure that the Cardano blockchain becomes more of a contributory ecosystem? So not just IoT always have to, pay and do the feedback and do everything, but how do we get the people who rely on the blockchain to actually participate in it? Secondly, why that's important is that when you think about it from an economic incentives perspective, and none of us know if the ADA utility token goes up and down. So we just have to kind of say, okay, so if that's stable, we have then some reserves out there, and luckily we have a very good monetary policy, right? But how do we ensure that over the years to come that there is sufficient incentive for people to keep contributing to the future Cardano technical roadmap and keep implementing that if the economic incentives are dwindling or going down? Or how do we ensure that the economic resources are being replenished in such a way that they actually make sense to stay in it? And more importantly, maybe even dependent on that, is the Stakepool operators. So when you look at it today, it's probably less than 1% of the incentives who go to the Stakepool operators are covered by the current transaction fee. And the transaction fee, the amount of transactions in certain days are actually larger than Ethereum or larger than Bitcoin. So it's not like there's nothing happening on chain. Mm-hmm. It's more to do with how much does it actually need to happen to think about economic sustainability. And I think open source is potentially one of those ways where you've seen and you've vetted that model and you've seen how large projects like the Apache Foundations or the Linux Foundation, actually creates an ecosystem where the people who rely on the underlying technology stack, they're willing to participate, contribute, and ensure a future technical roadmap. So I think that's the one part. Then there's up in the value capture layer, going all the way down from the actual users of an application down to this level, is what we think about as the community part. And here we've raised our hand and said, we want to do the Cardano Summit. We want to ensure that we can, as much as possible, orchestrate and encourage a positive community out there. And when I say community, that can be very wide, right? And sometimes you think, you're a part of the community, but you actually never interacted with the other part of the community. I mean, the Cardano community is very big these days. So we have a large community team. And we're starting to build a marketing team, because one of the things we never intended to do, but just it needed to be done, was I think Cardano needs to do more marketing.